Hello, everyone. I think it's now live and I see some people logging in. Give everyone a couple minutes to log on. I hope everyone had a great Mother's Day long weekend. I feel like Mother's Day is different depending on where you live. Canada and the US, I believe, was this past weekend, but I think in the UK it's at a different time. Someone wants to holler at me in the chat if I'm wrong or right.
I don't know if
I'm right.
whoever got long weekends, good for you. I don't know. That wasn't a thing for me.
I didn't get a long
Mother's
weekend.
Day, but I did not get a long weekend.
Yep, we have it in March in the UK.
I say that like I'm not the one who makes that decision. My boss is such an asshole. He's a real hard ass. I can never get away from
that,
him.
Actually.
He haunts me day and night.
He haunts you day and night. Second Sunday in May for the US. Awesome. Thanks, Renee. As people log on, is anyone's first time joining? I think I see some familiar names, maybe not all. You are new here, Danny. Welcome. Ralph? Okay. Oh, goodness. I really don't want to mess up your name. Is it Rashonda Williams? I always feel terrible. Yes. Thank you, girl. Great. So we have Christopher York, great 1000th time. Very odd because this is only the fourth workshop, but we'll go with 1000th. First time, Jordan Roscoe, welcome. Carla, yes, we do have replays. I'll link it in the chat just after we kick it off. Nicole, fourth time. Tommy, new here. Welcome, everyone. And Sam, also your first time. Well, welcome. I'm excited that you're here. You obviously don't hate money. That's why you joined today, but I'm really excited. So let's kick things off because I know Marcel wants to get real wild and get into this. So, what am I doing?
Juicy one today. Very important topic.
Juicy money. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our fourth workshop. My name is Colleen McGrath. I'm the Senior Manager of Community here at Vendasta, and I'm excited to host this panel with Marcel. Now, Marcel is Petapa. I know how to pronounce the name right now. Marcel Petapa is the CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto, a company that is dedicated to helping agencies measure and improve their profitability by streamlining their operations and reporting systems. He's an award-winning creative agency in San Francisco with working brands like Uber, Slack, Keep, and more, as well as the head of the strategic coach at SaaS Academy by Dan Martell. And it is the #1 coaching program for B2B SaaS businesses in the world. So we've done our research. He knows what he's talking about. If this is your fourth workshop, he's legit. So oh wait, no, not yet. I almost kicked it off way too soon. Not yet. If you do want to watch the replays, I think Carla, was it you who was asking about replays? You can see them in the Conquer Local Academy. And so in it, we have our Academy, community, and our podcast. So Vish is going to share the link directly to the Academy, and you'll be able to watch the replays. So now, without further ado, Marcel, over to you.
What is up, everyone? Thank you, Colleen, for having me back. I am far too excited about the thing that gets most agency owners not excited at all, which is metrics, profitability, how to measure things, the math behind the business. But I'm excited about it because this is probably the most important thing that most of us don't pay enough attention to in our businesses. So we're going to get into the subject du jour, which is really all about how to think about pricing and scoping your client work, the entry point, the starting point, the foundation for profitability. Metrics are sexy. Thank you, Rashonda. Thank you. I like to think metrics are sexy. I like to think of myself as the Ryan Reynolds of agency metrics, if you will. Am I stretching it a little too far? Maybe. Okay. Let's talk about agency profitability. Before I get into that, just to recap some of the things that Colleen said, this is what I do. I help agencies run more profitably at Parakeeto. I'm also the chief fractional COO at Goldfront, where we work with really cool brands that you've heard of. And I have a great podcast called the Agency Profit Podcast. At least I think it's great. So if you enjoy the content today, then you should subscribe to that show because we talk about this kind of stuff there all the time. So with that said, let's get into the topic du jour, which is scoping accuracy. So for those of you that are here for the first time, I want to remind you that we've done 3 of these sessions. And in the first 3 sessions, we talked about core financials. So the 4 core metrics that you should be able to see every time that you get financial reports back from your bookkeeper and accountant. And there's some quick wins in there that a lot of folks actually came to the second session and said, I talked to my accountant, I got some changes made. So really great session to go watch with some very low hanging fruit, quick wins that you can do to start getting better visibility today in your agency without changing the amount of money or time that you spend on this stuff. This is not the final session, Cody, because we have 2 bonus sessions afterwards where we get into some more advanced stuff. But this is where we're covering the first 4 sessions where we cover the foundation. But then because Vendasta, they're good negotiators and we're all just friendly Canadians, they convinced me to do an extra 2 sessions where we get to go even deeper into even more cool stuff. So good question, but this is not the last session. All right. Second session, we covered earning efficiency. And then the third section, we covered utilization. So those are all in the Conquer Local community. If you want to go watch the replays, so Vish is dropping links to that. Make sure you go check that out if you want to get up to speed on what we've covered so far and make sure that you capture those first 3 very important ways of measuring your business. Today, we're going to talk about the last kind of core pillar in the foundation of measurement before we start getting into advanced tactics in the next 2 sessions. And the last piece of this is scoping accuracy. Like it or not, the foundation of our agency's operations system is our ability to make accurate assumptions about client work. When you really think about it, what is agency operations other than taking assumptions about client work and trying to project them into the future, right? It's all about trying to get ahead of decisions about, do we need to hire people? Do we need to fire people? Do we have enough staff to do this thing? Do we need to bring in a freelancer? What happens if this project does or doesn't close, right? Are we going to make money on this? What's our cash flow going to look like? Can we make these investments, decisions, et cetera? It's all about planning ahead. But if the data we have to plan ahead is not good, then our plans will not be good either. And so this is one of the most overlooked, but also most foundational pieces of agency operations that we need to pay attention to. And today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different ways to essentially make our ability to come up with assumptions about client work much more accurate, even if we can't actually scope the work up front. Yes, even if the client's asking you for something that you can't wrap your arms around or isn't well defined or is impossible to scope, we'll talk about how to adapt contract structures and billing models so that you can still create sound plans and plan ahead in your business. I know that sounds crazy. This is what I'm going to show you how to do today. So we're going to start with some things that are really core to those of you that do things that you generally try to scope upfront, right? So this would be things like websites, digital marketing retainers, design projects, things where the client comes to you and says, I want X outcome or I want X deliverables. And you are able to confidently say to them, it's going to take this much time or it's going to cost this much money. And that's based on a set of assumptions that you believe are reasonably good about how much time and effort it's going to take to do something. In this context, there is a flywheel that you want to make sure you're baking into your business. And really, even in the other context where we're using alternative billing models, we still want to make sure that this is true. And if we install this flywheel correctly, we should have a system, a feedback loop that allows your business to get more efficient and profitable over time. Even if you as a founder are not involved in this process, this should empower your team to go ahead and make your business more profitable on your behalf and be good stewards of your efficiency and profitability. And so there are 4 key pieces to this. The first is estimates. It's not sexy, but it's true. The foundation of all of this is how you estimate work. And there's 2 really important aspects to estimates that we want to get right. Number 1 is the format. And number 2 is the methodology. Let's talk about those 2 concepts. The format is, what is the structure of our assumptions in an estimate? And I don't necessarily mean what font are we using in the document or what's the margin on the page. It's more about how do we think about the hierarchy of our assumptions? What are the objects within an estimate? Are we thinking about it in terms of how many hours per task, how many hours per service, how many hours per person? Where are those things nested? Do we have a client? And then within the client, we have maybe different projects or different deliverables. And within those deliverables, maybe we have phases or milestones. And then within those, maybe we've got tasks and subtasks. We want to sit down and really be clear about what is our hierarchy? How do we structure assumptions about client work and nail that down? it has to get nailed down because this will dictate how we need to set up all the other tools that we use in the rest of the agency for things like managing projects and tracking time, so that we can actually have data that is useful and consistent and allows us to start actually getting insight and see patterns in our business. So number one, nail down the format and structure for how you estimate client projects and structure assumptions about work. The second is the methodology. What is the actual process that you go through to come up with those assumptions? Who's involved? When are you doing it? At what point in the sales process? What questions do you ask the client to make sure you have all the correct inputs to accurately create these assumptions? Those two things, you should take a moment to sit down and create as much standardization as you can, because the more fluid your estimate structures are, you're going to see here in a moment, the more difficult it's going to be to really nail down and create a system here for the rest of the business. The estimates are the starting point. And so some attention should be paid here to really make sure that the way you're doing this is intentional. Once we have our estimates dialed in and we have the structure and the format reasonably standardized, then we want to go to time and cost tracking. Now, the critically important thing here is making sure that there is alignment between these two things. So give me a yes in the chat if you've ever asked the question, how much time did this project take us relative to what we estimated when we started the project? If you've ever tried to do that exercise, put a yes in the chat. Vish has done that. I've done it a million times. Most of us have probably at some point at least wondered about that question. Now, put a fire emoji in the chat if when you went to answer that question, you pulled some data from a time tracking tool or a spreadsheet, or you pulled some data from somewhere, and then you held up your estimate and they did not look at all the same. For example, your time tracking data was like task 1, task 2, task 3, this many minutes on wireframe UX mockup V1. And then in the estimate, it was like this many design hours, this many project management hours, et cetera, right? Rashonda, Sue, Nicole, Rini, Brandon, you're all hearing what I'm saying, right? So because the data doesn't look the same, now you have this extra step that you need to take in order to answer that question, which is I have to take all this time tracking data and somehow clean it up, transform it, get it into the same format as my estimate before I can get that answer. And because you're an agency owner with better shit to do, you don't do it. Because who has 2 hours to, clean up data in a spreadsheet to answer this question? Completely ridiculous. So this doesn't get done. We don't get the insight, and we just kind of keep flying by the seat of our pants. So critically important that once we lock down the format for our estimates, we apply that format here to our time and cost tracking data, so that whether we're using tags or we're using fields or custom fields or, some kind of whatever object we use in the time tracking data, there is perfect alignment and some way for us to group time in the same way that it's grouped on our estimates, so we can very easily answer this question before, during, and after a project of what is our estimate, and then what is this actually playing out like in reality. And this gives us a data feedback loop. It starts to give us some objective data about what actually happened, so that when we get into the second part of this framework, we can spend our time talking about why, getting curious, getting insights, as opposed to arguing about what we believe happened on a project, which is a very inefficient way to spend a project retrospective or a team meeting trying to get insights about a client engagement. I think we can all agree on that. And I'm sure we've all been in the room for that very painful conversation where there is nothing productive that happens, but we all spend a whole bunch of time arguing about what we think happened on the project, and we can't seem to agree on it because there's no data. So once we have our data in place, then of course, we want to start applying that in the business. And we have a saying inside of our company at Parakeeto, which says the data can only tell you what the data is. It can't tell you why the data is. Human beings need to do the rest of that exploration. And so we want to make sure that we have a cadence of reports and meetings where we're regularly looking at this data, surfacing patterns, and then engaging our team in discussions about why things might be going the way that they are. And this is not a disciplinary meeting. This is not a meeting where we go, Colleen, you spent twice as many hours planning your best friend's bachelorette party. My dad said it was amazing, but why did you spend so many extra hours? My dad wasn't at the bachelorette party though. He was at the wedding. Funny story, complete sidebar, but my dad is friends with Colleen. Totally random happenstance. So reports and meetings, we want to sit down, look for the pattern, and not crack down on Colleen and say, hey, you went way over budget, Colleen. You're bad at your job. We want to say, Colleen, I'm very curious. What is it about this project that didn't go the way that we expected? Did we miss something in the estimation? Was there something that came up that you weren't expecting? Were we unclear about the brief and you spent time on something that wasn't actually included? What happened in this scenario as opposed to being disciplinary in this conversation? And that should lead to process improvements, either to the way that we estimate things or to the way that we do things. Because sometimes we're bad at estimating things because, well, humans are bad at estimating things, but sometimes we're bad at estimating things because the way we do it is actually not that well defined. And so there is legitimately this widespread of time that it takes to do things because everyone's doing it a different way. And those are the kinds of insights that lead us over time as we go through this flywheel time and time again. We tighten process, we get more data, and we start to get more profit and more scale as a result of these things tightening up, right? So we have our data feedback loop at the top, and then here we have kind of our people feedback loop. And these two things work together to close these gaps. So what we're going to do is kind of talk through the nuances of each part of this framework, the data, and then we'll talk about the people, and then we're going to get into some really nerdy stuff and some of my favorite content around pricing and how to apply a lens to pricing and contract structure this. So the first thing we're going to talk about is really some basics on how to think through structuring your estimates and structuring your time and cost tracking data and getting them aligned. Before we get into this, I want to clarify something. Pricing and scoping. What's the difference between these two things? Pricing and scoping. Anyone want to take a stab in the chat at the difference between pricing and scoping? While I get hydrated, I hope all of you are hydrated as well. It's very important. There you go, Colleen. Pricing and scoping, what's the difference? Scoping is the estimate of how many hours the project will take. That's correct, Vish. Scope is the amount of work. Price is the cost of the work. Awesome. We've got some eager beavers in the chat that are on top of this question. So as many of you have alluded to, pricing is the question of what will the client pay? What will they pay? Right? How much are they willing to pay for this particular deliverable, for the agreement that we're trying to come to in the sales conversation? The question of scoping is what will it cost? What will it cost us, right? For us to deliver the thing that we're promising to the client. And so these things are related, but they're not the same. One has to do with the client. The other has to do with us. And there is this relationship, this back and forth that happens with these. However, the mistake I see a lot of agencies make is these are treated as one exercise. They're often in a single document. And even worse, the same document that the agency uses to come up with their own assumptions is the document that goes in front of the client. When in reality, these, I believe, should be two separate documents because they serve two very different purposes. One is for us to get clear and honest about our expectations internally about this project. The other is to communicate and negotiate with the client about what they're going to pay for the project. And we might have information that's shared between these two exercises, but I believe these should be two separate documents because they do two very different jobs. So what we're going to talk about right now is focused on scoping. And then we'll spend some time talking about pricing and how these two things are related. But just know that we really want to create two separate ideas of this. And what's important in scoping is being as honest and accurate as possible. And it's possible that the price doesn't give us the margin that we want or what have you. But if we're honest about the scope, then we know what the expectations are, and we can have a much more productive and insightful conversation after a project is over because we were clear about what we were setting ourselves up for at the start. If you've ever made this mistake, and I know I've made it, I'm guilty of this too, where the client pushes back on price, and instead of just discounting the price and then looking at the reality of how that affects your margins, you go into the scope and you start lowering the number of hours until the price makes sense. And then you go back to the client, you're like, yeah, okay, we can do it for that. But the scope hasn't actually changed. You just start pretending that somehow you're going to find a way to do it faster. Anybody ever done that before? Give me a yes in the chat if you've ever found yourself in that position. You start lowering the number of hours. Yeah, we've all done it, and it doesn't help us at all. We can still give the client that price without putting ourselves in this position where we've just created this unrealistic set of expectations that really rob us of the ability of getting good insight into that project, or just setting clear expectations for ourselves and our team about what we're setting ourselves up for. Because it's not a bad thing to discount. Sometimes you have to do it. That's okay. If your utilization is going to be crap next month, I'd rather sell an hour for $1 than have it basically go bad for $0. There are times when we need to do this, but let's be honest when we're doing this. Okay. This is a bit of a soapbox rant, but I think it's an important one. We're going to move on from it. The last thing I want to talk about is ideally, when you have a full pipeline and you're not afraid to lose the client and you feel like you've got some leverage in your sales process, what should you be targeting for margin or profit on a per project basis? And the delivery margin target. And if you're not familiar with what delivery margin is, then you need to go sign up for Conquer Local and watch the replay where I explain exactly what this is and show you the formula. The delivery margin target for a project is ideally 60 to 70% plus. And really the formula for this is you want to work up from your profit target. So if you want a net profit of, let's call it 30%, and you know that you're going to spend 30% of your agency gross income on overhead, we've got 30%. So this means we need at least 60% on a per project basis. But we know that from the project to the P&L, we're going to lose about 10%. So we want to add 10%. That gets us to 70. If you wanted a net profit of 20%, you were only going to spend 20% on overhead, then you could probably get away with 60. So that's kind of how you want to do this math, is work up from what's my net profit target. Make sure you apply a buffer of 10 to 15% to what you want to land on the P&L. And that is what you want to start targeting on a per project basis. So that's the deal on profit. And there's two ways to measure this again. And we went deep on this in one of the previous trainings, but this is your delivery margin or ABR target. So you could use the same math, look at what's the average billable rate that we're going to probably get on this project. If you understand your average cost per hour, you can figure out what the rough delivery margin is. So that covers in a nutshell how we think about scoping accuracy. The next thing I want to talk about is how we actually use this. Before we do that, I want to talk really quick about estimates versus time and cost tracking. Just want to draw out a model here really quick in the Q&A section. This is the simple concept here, and it should be clear to everyone, but I want to draw it out. If we have on the estimate and our time tracking, two different concepts, right? So let's imagine here we have the client, we have the project, then we have like role one, right? Like design. Role two is development. This is a 2, role 3, etc. And then in the time tracking, we have a client, we have a project, and then we get into like tasks, task 2, task 3, right? And these things don't match up. This is no good, right? What we want to make sure is that we get alignment from the estimate into the project management tool so that everything matches up. And one hack here is if you do end up with a bunch of discrete tasks that you're tracking time against, you could use a tagging system or a custom field, right? It doesn't really matter what tooling you're using. Just make sure that in some way you can pull a report and group time back to the same format that your estimate dictated time needs to be grouped in so that you can get back to that core answer. So that is the long and short on this kind of first part of estimates and time and cost tracking and how to think about pricing versus scoping. Now what we're going to do is talk about how do we actually use this information? So what does this look like in practice? If you recall from one of the previous sessions, we talked about average billable rate reporting. So here's a simple example of a report that we might pull, where we have all the projects that we've done in a given time period. We have the estimated average billable rate, right? What we were expecting when we scoped the project, and then the actual average billable rate. And so now we can spot some outliers. Okay. So clearly project 1, that was a good project. We did 178 when our plan was 150. So we would answer the question of what happened. Well, we did amazing on this project, high five team. And then we would start to ask why and what are the opportunities? So what is it about this project that was different than the other ones? Why were we so profitable? Was there something that we did that was more efficient? Was there something we did in estimation that gave us some more padding, right? What happened here and what can we learn from this and apply to other projects? And similarly, we could look at project number 2 and go through the same process. Okay, project number 2, we wanted 150, we got 136. Same questions. Why did this happen? Did we miss something in estimation? Was there something unexpected that came up? Was there something that happened during the process that took longer than what we thought? What can we learn from this? What are the opportunities for us to get better next time? And this should generate from the team a backlog of ideas, which can start leading to the process improvements that we talked about earlier. And here's a really, really key and important thing for those of us that have a team. Often we already know what the problem is and we already know what the answer is. It's very important that we go into these meetings and try as much as possible to let the team bring these ideas forward, because the team is far more likely to execute, follow, document, and hold their peers accountable to processes that they came up with as opposed to they were told to do, right? So we really want to try to take the facilitator lens in these conversations. And if we're going to be training our project managers to run this process, we want to allow them to really become facilitators. And the objective here is to try to empower the team and say, Vish, wow, that's a great idea. Sending out an email that asks people if they hate money and telling them to delete their calendar invites. I think that's super brilliant. Would you be comfortable with executing on that this week so that we can get more amazing agency owners on a session like this so they can learn how to run a better business? And Vish is like, yeah, that's great. Oh my God, I feel so good because Marcel just told me I had a really good idea and I'm a snappy dresser. So that's an example of how we want to run this conversation, as opposed to saying, hey, like, this is the problem and you should all do this. Yeah, it was a great email, wasn't it, Rasanda? All right. So then the question becomes, okay, well, often we come out of these meetings and we have a lot of different ideas. So the rule that we created at Parakeeto is actually slightly different than what I'm about to teach you. And so the best thing to do is to only ever leave the meeting with one action item that you're going to take action on. And our thesis behind this is we're not going to get anything more than one done because we're busy with client work. We're booked out until August. So like, we don't have time to do 100 things. And if something's actually a problem, it's going to show up again, right? If it's actually a systemic issue, it's going to keep coming up in the backlog. And so eventually we're going to have no choice but to pick it off. And over, the last 15 audits that we've done or so, this is exactly what's happened. It forced us to pick the most important thing. And now we're struggling to find things that are going wrong because over time we've chipped away at all the important stuff. So I know it's painful. We don't want to have lingering issues in our process, but one way to really refine all these ideas and actually make this effective is to say, we only ever leave a retrospective meeting with a single action item, a single project that we're going to install between now and the next one. The alternative to that, though, is actually using a prioritization matrix. And so this is a simple framework for prioritization called ICE. And essentially what we do is we rank each of the ideas based on 3 factors. What is the impact that we think this is going to have on the intended outcome? What is the confidence that we have that this will actually have that intended outcome? Essentially, that's risk. And what's the effort required to get this done? So to give you an example of this, if we have 2 ideas in the backlog, one is update the template for the client kickoff meeting, update the agenda. And the second one is, I don't know, go and like add a new feature to the automation tooling that we built to automatically create client folders for this particular process. If we were to rank those 2 in terms of impact, let's assume that both of them are going to have a similar amount of impact in terms of reducing the amount of time it takes us to do a project. Our confidence level would be like, okay, what's our level of confidence that asking different questions in the client onboarding process is going to lead to a better outcome versus what's our confidence level that writing the tooling is actually going to be successful. And then effort would be like, okay, it takes 5 minutes to update the outline for the client kickoff meeting, and it might take a week of development time to update the tooling. So that's how you might think about ranking these things. And then the formula for creating the winners is impact times confidence divided by effort. So what this should do is surface the ideas that have the highest level of impact with the lowest amount of effort. And this is an easy way that you can start to prioritize things. And we have a Airtable template that does all this math for you in our agency profitability toolkit, if you happen to check that out. So this is the high level on how to think about making sure your estimates and time tracking data align, and then how to actually use this data to create process improvements. Let's talk about how this actually works to make your generally flat rate or scoped projects more accurate. You're going to get a lens into how my brain works here. And I apologize if this gives you nightmares, but this is how my brain works. So if we think about estimation, and we think about what we're really doing most of the time when we're having a negotiation or a sales conversation with a client, we're generally trying to figure out what is the relationship between the things that the client is telling us and the amount of effort it's going to take to do something. In some way, this is like what we're all trying to do. And so if you think about it, we're trying to draw this graph in our heads where we have effort on one axis. And usually we're thinking about effort in terms of hours. And then we have complexity on the other axis. And there could be a lot of different things that we look at for complexity, like how many web pages does this website have, or how many stakeholders are involved in this conversation. But ultimately, a simple way that we can start measuring this is just, what is the budget, right? How much money is this client willing to spend? And then what we can start to do is collect these two pieces of data on every single project. How many hours did they take, and how much was the budget, right? So all of these red dots are projects that we complete. And over time, what we'll start to do is build relationship lines where we can start to understand by different segments, what is the relationship between $1 of budget and an amount of effort. And depending on how we have set up our estimates and time and cost tracking data, that will determine how we can start to slice this down. So for example, if we have started to structure our estimates such that we have a project type, and then we have 3 roles within that project type. So for example, we have websites versus funnels. And then within this, we have roles, which is like PM, design, and development, right? So if we have defined our estimate structure such that we can discern these kind of pieces of metadata, then what we can start to do is actually run this graph. Imagine that this is asking us, what is the relationship between $1 of budget and project management time on websites? And now what we can start to see is, okay, for every $1 of budget that we add to a website project, it adds 0.6 hours of project management time, which would be insane. Hopefully that's not how much project management at times it takes per $1 of websites work, but you get the idea. What we can start to get to is a place where we ask the client a couple of questions, we figure out their budget, we put a number in a spreadsheet, and our estimate is done for us. And we basically have identified, okay, the client has a $50,000 budget. So it's going to take roughly this amount of project management hours. And we could automate this for all of the roles that are required. And then from there, that last 10, 20% becomes subjective. So, okay, client's a bit of an a-hole, 10% a-hole tax, and that gets us like right about here. We're good to go. Feels like a pretty solid estimate. And what you might find is that over time, you notice that, okay, our dots are kind of all over the place, right? We have projects that cost the same, but they take wildly different amounts of time. That's usually a pretty good sign that our process needs improvement. So this green line here, this is process. And as we refine our process, what this should do is start to squeeze the distribution of the data points closer to the middle line, because it's going to more and more clearly define what is the possible spread. And over time, this relationship line gets more and more reliable, and we essentially build an algorithm for how to estimate inside of our organization, which means that anybody on the team can do this, and they can do it to a high degree of accuracy in a couple of minutes. And we have clients that can scope like $500,000 projects in under 10 minutes because they've got this data and they've been collecting it over the course of 6 months, a year, 12 months. And now they're at a place where they can very, very quickly generate estimates for very large, very complex problems because they have the data to back it up. So that is how this kind of works in practice. When we start collecting data, how we can actually apply that to speeding up and making our estimation process more accurate. The last thing I want to talk to here before we wrap up is the agency pricing quadrant. So we've talked here about how to scope things, how to collect data and use that to make us more intelligent at scoping things. But then the question is, how do we price things? Give me a yes in the chat if you've ever been targeted with an advertisement that tells you you're a complete idiot if you sell anything by the hour, that you have been made to feel less than if you bill by the hour. My LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook feed is full of this. I'm going to call it lore, or this zeitgeist that I think is very, very popular in the agency coaching industry. There are a lot of people that want to sell me a business model or sell me a pricing model as though it's the only answer, when the reality is it's not appropriate for everyone. And so I'm going to give you all a radically different take on this than you might have heard before. And I'm going to make the case for why it's okay to bill by the hour. It's okay to bill abstracted time materials. It's okay to use flat rates. It's okay to bill on value. What's important is making sure that your pricing model is appropriate for your business model. So let's talk about that. When I'm thinking about what is the right way to price something, I'm considering two primary factors. The first factor is risk. So on this axis, we have low risk. And on this, we have high risk. And so how do I define risk? Basically, how close to the estimate do I get on a consistent basis? So if I can get to within 10% of the amount of time that I estimated for a project, that's pretty low risk work. An example of this is I build websites for legal firms on the Elementor template. I've done 1,000 of them, and I can get to within 10% of the hours estimated time and time again, because we've just done it so many times. We know what it takes. We have a great process, right? This is a mature service offering. That's low risk. On the other end of this is I run a software development shop, and I'm using new technology languages that are not very well documented. And I'm helping SpaceX write control systems that help land rocket boosters on barges in the middle of the ocean. That's extremely high risk work. It could take 100,000 hours. It could take 1,000,000 hours, and it might not even be possible to solve that problem using this programming language. So for you to kind of try to sit there and scope this up front with the client is a bit insane. That's high risk work. It's an extreme example, but you get the idea. And I'm not here to, and this is, I think, what really bothers me. Again, I'm getting on my soapbox. I apologize, but this is what really ticks me off about the agency coaches and consultants out there that try to make it seem like everybody has to move towards productizing their services and pricing on value. If everybody did that, who would solve that problem? Who would build enterprise websites? Who would solve complex software development problems? Somebody needs to do it. And that business model does not work for high risk work. So I'm going to tell you what does work for high risk work. Before I do that, let's talk about the other axis here, which is value. We have high value work and we have low value work. And I also want to tell you all that there's nothing wrong with doing low value work. It's hard. It's not going to be fun. You have to be an operations nerd to make this work because you're competing on efficiency. But I'm not here to tell you that you're less than because you want to go into a highly competitive space and you want to lean on your ability to be a good operator. That's okay. The only thing that matters at the end of the day is that you can maintain healthy delivery margins. If that's true, your business is profitable. If you can spend 30 to 40 cents to earn $1, then everything else doesn't matter. You've got a profitable business. So let's talk about value really quick. What does this mean? High value is usually determined by two things. Number one, what is the competitive landscape for the service that you're offering? How commoditized is it? So if I say I do graphic design, I have inherently put myself in a low value position because I'm now competing against probably millions of people at this point, including Design Pickle, who theoretically does air quotes unlimited design for $400 a month, right? So I am in a low value positioning. However, if I say I help B2B enterprise SaaS companies visually communicate complex data systems using design, same service, graphic design, radically different positioning, far more expertise, far more scarcity. How many other firms specialize in solving that problem? Probably not that many. So same service, different positioning, different value based on scarcity. The second major impact of value is relative value to the client. So if I do conversion rate optimization, and I help Apple.com improve their conversion on their website by 2%, that is hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue for Apple. If I improve my Aunt Shirley's Etsy shop where she sells handmade bracelets by 2%, that's a couple $100s in value. Same outcome, maybe even the same amount of effort, probably not the same amount of effort, but let's imagine that it is for a moment, but radically different value. Aunt Shirley's not going to pay me $1 million to do that project, but Apple probably would because it's just a small fraction of the upside for them. So there's lots of other factors that influence value, but those are the two primary axes: scarcity and positioning, as well as relative value for the client. So depends how much you love Aunt Shirley. Yeah. Oh yeah. Aunt Shirley. We'll throw Aunt Shirley a bone, of course, but we're not going to give her the same treatment as Apple. But you just keep grinding. Yeah, Aunt Shirley pay with food. That's true. Yeah, she'll bring meatballs to the family Christmas party. Okay, so let's talk about what we do in each of these situations. Let's start in the bottom left-hand corner. If we have high-risk work that has low value, what do we typically do here? Well, this is where we want to go time and materials or hourly. Why? Well, because the value is low and the risk is high. And so when the risk is high, we typically want to try and share some risk with the client. Because if they're asking us to do something that's high risk, then unless they're willing to take risk off the table for us, then we need to try and share some of that risk with them. So in this case, billing by the hour, I think, is okay. The game here becomes, how do we make sure that our cost per hour is no more than 40, maybe 50% of our hourly rate, and that we bill as many hours as possible to the client that we have to work to get this project done, so we're not eating very many hours. That becomes the game. But as long as we maintain that relationship of cost per hour to hourly rate, then we have margin. We're okay. And we can scale this model as long as we can continue to find talent and deploy it against earning revenue at that rate. The next situation is where we have high risk work that is high value. This is where I like abstracted time and materials. This is a billing model that not many people are familiar with, but is one of my favorites for companies that do work for enterprise. Two good examples of this would be Media Monks, or one of the big agencies here in town called Thinking Big. They like build websites for the Canadian government, do custom software projects. The way that they bill is they say, hey, instead of talking in terms of hourly rates, they say, we have this cross-functional team. It's 2 developers, a half an architect, a quarter of a strategist, and a designer. And they're going to be working on your project. And we estimate it's going to take between 10 and 30 sprints, and our sprints are 2 weeks long, to complete the deliverables that you've outlined. Understanding that the way we have to solve this problem is using agile development. And so we can't really tell you exactly how long it's going to take, because part of the process is learning and adapting as we go along. So you're selling them the ideal process for solving that thing. But what you're doing to protect yourself from the high risk is you're anchoring your pricing to your cost basis, right? You're selling a predetermined amount of somebody's time, and then you move at a certain velocity. The unlimited white label partners, like the Design Pickles and the, like the people who sell you unlimited X for Y, this is how they bill. They're selling you a fraction of a resource, because here's the trick. If you ask them to do 1 million tasks, you're going to have to wait 19 months for that millionth task to get done. And you're going to get a phone call from the white label partner to say, hey, I noticed you asked for a lot of tasks. You're going to have to wait a long time for those. Do you want to increase your retainer so we can move faster? That's abstracted time materials. You leverage the fact that there's high value to pull the conversation away from the hour, but you still use the mechanics of hourly billing to protect yourself from high risk. This is some ninja level stuff here, how to think about high value, high risk work. Next is low risk, low value. This is generally where you're doing a flat fee, right? So if I came to you and said, hey, I can build you a website. Vish, you need a website for your new beanbag baby flipping e-commerce store, because you've been watching too much Gary Vaynerchuk, and you're like, I need a website, bro. And I'm like, okay, it's going to cost you $500 an hour. Vish is probably going to go, that seems really expensive. I don't want to hire you to build my website. But if I said, Vish, guess what? I can give you a blazing fast, SEO optimized, proven to convert website. I can get it to you in 2 weeks, and it's only going to cost you $5,000. You'd probably be like, actually, that's a pretty good deal. I'll do that deal. I might still make $5,000 an hour, but Vish feels good about it. And why is that? It's because I have low risk. And so I've arbitraged that low risk to offer certainty and clarity on price to the client, and leveraging the fact that I know how to be efficient to increase my hourly rate. So flat rates work really, really well in this situation, where we can really give clarity to the client, help them feel like they're getting a good deal by using a flat rate. The last quadrant, this is the most advanced form of pricing, is value-based pricing, value-based. So again, here we're leveraging the value to the client and the fact that we have low risk to start to try and tie our value to the performance. So the simplest example of this is saying, hey, Apple.com, you said you would make an extra $1 billion in revenue if I helped you increase your conversion rate by 1% on the website. Would you be willing to give me 10% of that upside to do this work? Which, what's 10% of $1 billion? $100 million? Is that right? Yeah. So maybe they'll not pay me $100 million, but they might pay me 50 if we negotiate. So that's the first level of value-based pricing. The next level of value-based pricing is pay for performance, where I would say, okay, why don't you give me X% of every additional conversion above what you're already making on the website as my compensation? But you can see here that it's very important that we have low risk in order to do value-based pricing, because it requires us to have a lot of clarity on the effort it's going to take to get this thing done, or the results that our clients will get. It requires pretty high maturity in our process and our product. So the mistake I see a lot of people make is they move to value-based way too early. And one of two things has to be true. You either have to price the product high enough to absorb the high risk, which means you're typically charging a lot of money, or you need to essentially eat a lot of downside if you mess things up and absorb a lot more risk than is necessary. So this is how we think about pricing based on the different contexts. And the last thing I want to say here is that it's normal for product offerings and service offerings to shift as you pull different levers and as your business matures. So if you're just starting out, you might not have a big portfolio, a lot of impressive client logos. You might not have a lot of trust. You might not have figured out your positioning yet. And so you might be on the low value end of the spectrum. But over time, it's natural for you to progress, up this way. And similarly, in the early days of a service offering, you might not have much process. You might not have much data around how much time it takes you. And so the risk is high. But over time, those things should start to decrease to some extent. And so it's normal for things to start migrating up into the right over time. So understand that a service offering is not locked into a particular quadrant and that over time it can move. And also understand that if you're finding that your clients really want to buy in a certain way, now you understand what levers you can pull to move a service offering into the quadrant that's going to map best to your market. So if a client really wants a flat rate, then you know you have to pull probably a risk lever to get yourself into a flat rate quadrant. And so then it becomes a question of what are all the ways that I can decrease risk for myself, defining scope, different things like that, outsourcing high risk work to white label partners. There's all kinds of different levers we can pull here, but that's the general idea. So I have probably gone over time. I don't have a hard stop. I know that there's some questions, but if you all have a hard stop, we can wrap this up and I can answer them in the group. I'll defer to you. But hopefully that was all good stuff. Please fill out the feedback survey, and I have a bunch of free stuff for you in the toolkit where you can go deeper on what we've learned today.
Thank you, Marcel. Yeah, mic drop. You talk fast, your penmanship impeccable. Totally knew what some of those things we were writing were. Good thing we share his slides after inside of the community group, because sometimes I don't know what he's writing in his scribbles. We are over time, so we're going to answer one question. Renee, you're the first question. Do you allocate so many planning and meeting hours into each role on a project, a percentage based on complexity and client challenge? I'm going to say client challenge. Do you allocate so many planning and meeting hours into each role on a project, a percentage based on complexity and client challenge?
Renee, this is a good question. Are you comfortable actually unmuting yourself and asking, is that possible? I just want to understand the context here and make sure I really understand what's being asked.
I don't know.
Planning and meeting hours into each role on a project.
Allow. I'll unmute if possible. Okay, Renee, I added you. Can you unmute yourself now?
Yes, can you hear me?
There we go, we hear you.
I was gonna say, I think you might have to pull me into the panel or something.
You're fancy now.
Hi, Marcel. Basically,
hi.
What I was saying is that you were talking about allocating so many hours to each role. And then in talking about that was further back in the presentation. So now I have to remember the context of my question. I think what I was figuring is that sometimes, depending on the complexity of the project, there's the hours that a particular role may spend actually doing the work, but then there also may be hours where the whole team is meeting and planning and speccing it out and all of that kind of stuff. And if it's a client, a PETA client, I call it, we might even have, times where we're just talking through the latest craziness that they've said or, adjusting accordingly. So when you're estimating, do you normally allocate those kind of hours into each role, or do you literally, have a bucket of meetings, kind of quote overhead per project? I was just curious how you address that.
It's a great question. The short answer is yes. And then the nuance, of course, is like, how much complexity is there in the variation of who's going to be involved in those meetings? But generally, you'll know, like, okay, status meetings involve everybody. So everybody's like 15 minutes every week for the duration of the project. These specific like client brief meetings involve these people. So if you can discern it at that level, I would be baking that into the fundamental assumption. And then over time, as you get time tracking data, that stuff will become more clear. There is another more advanced tactic, which we'll talk about in a future session, which is a second layer that you can apply to this way of thinking about scoping, which is a complexity matrix. And so this is a way of really kind of codifying what are the 3 to 5 major factors that are going to influence the amount of PITA in this case for our client, and then actually being formulaic about contingency. So as an example, do they have one stakeholder or are we dealing with 7? Do they want 10 pages on their website or are we dealing with 100? Do they want just like a standard template or do we need to build custom widgets? So being able to like clearly identify what are the 3 to 5 things that are going to like massively determine how much additional complexity is involved in this project, then we can start to build formulas around that as well and start to use, well, at Parakeeto, at least we use linear algebra to actually build real data around the relationship of like how much does this actually impact the amount of meetings or the amount of additional time that we have to take. But the simple answer to your original question is yes, factor that in to your estimates. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. So we are definitely over time. Brandon and Renee, you actually had a couple other questions, so we'll put them in the community group and get Marcel to give us some feedback there. So thank you everyone for attending workshop number 4. Vish, if you could just share that link one more time in the chat for the Academy. Yes, I'm so excited to see you all next week. Thank you again, Marcel.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. See you next week.
Take care, everyone.